Students, hey, it's Dr. Gavin. Thought I would share a few thoughts with you this week on one topic that's always been curious and interesting to observe and also to participate in, and obviously the topic is power. Spent a lot of times working at various levels: the employee level, the manager level, the general manager level, the mid-manager level, and the executive level. And I've seen power, and I've seen it in various shapes and forms and various applications. So I just had a few comments this week on a few of the topics that come from the textbook. First of all, what's interesting is the definitions of power, influence, and authority. One of the things I can tell you is that power and influence can look similar, um, but there are pretty distinct differences in terms of how they are used. I've seen people at lower levels have more influence than the person in power, which gave the illusion that they had power, but they really didn't. They had influence. Certainly, authority is very clear relative to position and title, um, but sometimes people don't really understand the significance of their authority or how to use their authority in ways that's meaningful to the employee, to the company, and to customers. In terms of consequences, particularly on the power holder, I tell you, when you get power, particularly when you're new and being promoted into a next level position, power changes things. It changes people. I've seen it so many times. The book talks about positive effects. Certainly, new leaders are very much anxious and very action oriented in terms of change and getting things done that they think are most important, and sometimes in their zeal, just don't take time to fully understand before setting out to implement changes. But certainly, particularly when someone is promoted up a level, typically they are more sensitive towards others, at least at first. And that seems to change over time. And the higher up you go with these promotions, quite honestly, the less sensitive you become. Obviously, a new leader is always focused on making sure he or she does things correctly. In terms of being generous, I think that more apt to want to make friends rather than enemies, or at least smart leaders, particularly newly promoted leaders, want to make friends and not enemies. In terms of the negative effects, and this typically, from my experience, happens when people are on their way out of power, wanting to retain power at all costs. I tell you, at the executive level, I have watched um, various functional areas of the organization that I work for. I've watched power change hands. For example, there was a time, probably 8 years ago, when at Darden, the marketing department, the marketing function really had the power in terms of strategic decisions. And when things started to turn, and I mean really turn for the bad at Darden, what you started to see was marketing, started to flex and influence things much more, and have much more power in terms of the decision making than marketing did. And you saw the marketing people really scrambling to retain power, and it really damaged the company, to tell you the truth. There were some differing views on strategic initiatives that weren't the decisions weren't good decisions, and they were based on really people trying to hold on to their power. The book talks about a false belief that they understand others well, and I'll tell you, the higher up the food chain you go, the less you understand of others, which leads to the next point: oblivious to others' needs. You just lose touch. I tell you, when I went from the director level to the senior director level, I really struggled to stay in touch because there were so many meetings and so much administrative work that you sort of fall out of touch with what the realities are, in the units. Losing the ability to emphasize when you start seeing things strategically. Um, it does impact your ability to emphasize with your people to some degree. Taking credit for other people's work, I've seen it. I've seen that happen more than once. So when we look at individual sources of power, and the book talks about these five, which are certainly the ones that we need to focus on. Their legitimate power just by title and position. People attain and can exercise power. Um, Reward power, is, and I tell you, as you move up the food chain, there are perks and benefits and different things that you have access to, both personally and things that you can give your team members. Whether it's nominating them for an award, or whether it's putting them on a project that allows them to get an expense account or a company car. There certainly are. There certainly is a lot of power in terms of rewards. Coercive power, which is really the most destructive of all three. And I'll tell you, these top three, as the book states correctly, really have more to do with how the organization is structured, and just sort of how the culture allows certain individuals at certain levels to have and to use their power. But coercive power is just, there are times when it's necessary. I talk a lot about leadership style with one of my other classes, and the command and control type of leadership can appear, to be coercive, but there are times when it's necessary. Most of the time, it's not. It's a bad day when someone uses coercive power as a default, and I've worked for bosses who were like that. They use threat, intimidation, and fear to motivate people, or to get people to do what they want them to do. And it's so unfortunate that happens, because the longer those people are in power, the more people under them uh, you know develop that type of a leadership style. I tell you, when you work for someone who uses threat, fear, intimidation to motivate people, whether you know it or not, that stuff rubs off on you, and you have to be very, very careful, because over time, it just does. I found myself in that situation a couple of times, and thankfully, I was able to gain enough self awareness, and really decided that I didn't want to be that way or to treat people that way. But be careful when you have someone that you work for that uses coercive power on a regular basis. Expert power, I had a boss one time when I was a director. She was a senior vice president, and she was so strong when it came to subject matter expertise. I mean, she knew all recipes, she knew procedures, process, she knew all the guidelines, the handbook, she knew the rules. She was an expert when it came to our business, our company, our processes, our systems, and she expected everybody else under her to have that same level of expertise. And I tell you, I admired her for that. And people admire experts, and I'll tell you, at the unit level, oftentimes, unfortunately, managers don't have the kind of expertise, subject matter expertise that they should have. And oftentimes, people will go to that person who does have that expertise. And I'll tell you that person then, begins to have power and influence over those people. Reverent power is the ideal power. Reverent power really speaks to someone's character, I think. It really speaks to how well someone is admired and liked and trusted. To me, when you have reverent power, you have the ultimate power. Because people believe in you, they believe in your vision, and they tend to align themselves with whatever it is that you are asking them to do. In terms of reactions to these different sources of power, and this is not rocket science here. Resistance, particularly when it comes to change, can be a very, very difficult thing for individuals and organizations to sort of navigate. I'm a firm believer that coercion is not the right tactic when it comes to change. I believe that one has to ensure at the strategic level that everyone leading the change, and I'm talking about even down to the unit general manager, has to either have accepted the change or they believe and see the vision and the reason for the change. When you have those people at the top, and when I say the top, I'm talking about the top of the unit on up, who have either accepted or believe in that change, then you can implement real change and you can meet resistance, and help people to get clarity and to work through it. In terms of compliance, that's what we typically get, in terms of the 70 to 80% of the people at the front line. We typically get compliance. What we look for is commitment. As a researcher, I spend a lot of time looking at organizational commitment, researching organizational commitment and ways to improve organizational commitment. But organizational commitment mediates a lot of different things: people's intentions to quit. It mediates burnout. It mediates citizenship behavior. There's a lot of things that commitment will get you. And certainly expertise and reverent power are two sources of power that sort of drive that level of commitment. Influence. Persuasion is very interested in leadership. I tell my students in one of my other classes all the time that if you're going to attempt to persuade me to do something, you need to have a rational argument. You need to have logic. And I don't mean faulty logic. I mean logic that's, deductive, inductive. You need to have some type of a logical appeal. The only time emotional appeals work with persuasion really is in marketing and sales. But rationality is so important when it comes to persuasion. My favorite of all these that are on the list here is the inspiration. Because if you can inspire someone, if you can encourage their heart, if you can get them to see the vision, if you can paint and articulate a clear, compelling picture or vision of the future or what you need them to do, you can align 60, 70, maybe even 80% of your population. I tell my students all the time that spend that time providing clarity, spend that time helping people to understand, spend that time painting a high resolution picture of what the future looks like and what's in it for those people. Because when you do that and you do it effectively, then you are coaching, you're following up with a far less percentage than you are if you don't articulate an inspiring and a compelling vision. Let's see. The only other, let's see, personal appeal, of course, that goes without saying. Um, the only other one that I'll really comment on here is pressure. There's always pressure, and if you work for a publicly traded company, you are consistently under some type of pressure. Pressure doesn't have to look like stress, though, and there's a difference. There needs to be some tension. I'm a firm believer that in leadership, there needs to be a certain amount of tension. People need to have a slight edge on them in order for there to be, in order for the environment to operate with less complacency. There needs to be some tension in the environment. The issue, oftentimes with pressure, is that it can appear to be stress, and it's really important, to make sure that people aren't under stress because, as you know, stress causes a lot of bad things to happen to people, and it really causes a lot of bad things to happen to organizations when people start to break down. So that's all I wanted to say on that one. Career stages. I'll tell you, I tell these undergrad students all the time that becoming a subject matter expert is an absolute must. There's no way, no better way, particularly out of the gate, to gain respect and credibility to become a subject matter expert. Credibility, relationships, and expertise are so critical, particularly early on in the career, in terms of gaining power. And sometimes power isn't, power can be informal. It doesn't necessarily have to come through authority. I know in a lot of situations we had units where employees had power. Power over the general manager, power over sometimes, excuse me, power over the manager, sometimes power over the general manager, because they had that expertise, they had that credibility, and they just demonstrated that when the situations arose. Let's see, legitimate power. As we move up in our careers, we do get that authority. We get that next level of authority. That's so important that we use that correctly. And it's so important that we guide our integrity and our character from those who might influence us into being the wrong kind of leader. Certainly, towards the late, as the book says here, and towards the later stages of one's career, it is about letting go. It is about passing the torch. I would say that along the way, it's always about developing that next level. It's always about, the future and succession planning. So a part of gracefully letting go is really preparing people, to take over those positions of power as we mature and as we end our careers, as I did with Darden, only to start a new one here at UNLV, but nevertheless, succession planning is so important through all those stages. The book talks a lot about abuse and corruption, and while the definitions differ, I don't really see a big difference here. I'm not a fan of either one. Whenever someone is unethical, it sort of falls to me in the same category, whether you want to call it abuse or whether you want to call it corruption. But obviously, legality is one of the key issues in differentiating these two these two words here or descriptions. But I will tell you that I learned something a long time ago. I forget where the quote came from, but it was that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So anytime you've got someone in power, there's always the risk of abuse and corruption. Whether it's the restaurant manager padding the inventory, or pulling his truck up to the back of the restaurant and filling it up with cases of steaks. There's always going to be people who who engage, in these types of behaviors. Some of the causes of corruption. The book talks about an inflated view of self. I always, be mindful and on the lookout for people who are so anxious to have their name up in lights. People who it's all about them. This sort of narcissistic pattern of behavior that some leaders develop over time, whether they're chasing higher titles or more authority. When leaders aren't given their followers credit, that's always a bad sign for me. In terms of and I'll tell you from the perspective of rigid and inflexible, that's an organizational issue. Some organizations just don't have any grace or any forgiveness. There are penalties that are significant penalties when people make mistakes, and I'll tell you, it certainly can lead to corruption. Sense of entitlement, a willingness to exploit others. All these are just, to me, they're character flaws. A lack of empathy. A lack of empathy happens, okay, as you get further and further up the food chain. Although, I don't think it consciously happens. I think that we become more strategic, therefore we think more big picture and sort of lose touch again with those people closest to the ground. Being vicious and ruthless, to me, that's again a character issue. Um, um, yeah, that's about all I got on this slide here. Let's see. In terms of the followers, fear is a terrible, terrible consequence of coercive power. Um, and it causes it causes corruption in followers. I mean, when people are afraid, they do very, very stupid things. Whether it's responding or reacting in an inappropriate way, or just trying to cover themselves because they fear being fired, and doing things that are inappropriate, or that are deceitful. Fear is a terrible, terrible emotion, and anytime a leader, inflicts fear on their followers, I cringe, and it bothers me deeply that happens. Silence, I tell you, here at UNLV, just between you and I've learned to be silent, because there's just so many, um, you know, um, people who have agendas, and there's the politics is so thick, and I'm just not used to academia. So, that's one of the things that's happening to me right now. I'm just learning to just keep my mouth shut and keep it moving. Um, Agreement, people, when people um, are really working in an environment where they see corruption. Most of them just try to stay below the radar, and they don't do any more or any less than what's expected. They just try to survive. So it's just a terrible situation for people to be in. In terms of the organization, culture, culture is interesting on many different levels. Certainly, you have an organizational culture, but you also have oftentimes divisional, regional, and sometimes even local subcultures that can or cannot be, that are or not corrupt. And sometimes it's hard to discern, uh, you know, whether there is corruption at any of those levels, because people generally do a pretty good job of hiring it. I will tell you that um, hiring practices are so important. People like to hire individuals that are like them, that have the same value system that they do. And when you have individuals who use their power in corrupt ways or abuse their power. They like and they hire and they promote people that have that kind of a value system. So you have to be very, very careful of that. We've all seen the Wall Street catastrophes with this short-term orientation and how that creates corruption. If you work for a publicly traded company, it's very important to keep tabs on board meetings, to keep an eye on how things are being discussed on conference calls and read annual reports. I don't know if you all have seen the latest on Darden, but there is so much going on at Darden relative to um, um, the cry for change from minority stockholders and these private equity companies really wanting to what as they call optimize shareholder value, which really means squeeze all the blood out of the company that they can and then sell the stock off. But be careful of this Wall Street short-term orientation phenomenon, particularly if you work for a publicly traded company. Yeah, I think I put that slide back in here because a part of letting go, um, you know, is really, I think a part of it is empowerment, and empowerment can, depending on the culture, there's a lot of studies on empowerment. Some would say that empowerment is not a good thing. Others would say that the only way to move forward in terms of engagement and other metrics that companies use to measure their culture is to have more empowerment. I believe that empowerment that you can delegate and you can empower people, um, but at the same time the responsibility falls back on the one doing the empowering because you know you have to be great at picking the right people to empower. And it's a tough call, particularly when you're doing it broadly across an entire enterprise or across an entire concept. You just have to really be careful. The book talks about high standards and just a great positive atmosphere and all these things are right, and I tell you, I believe in all of them, but you have to be careful with empowerment because sometimes empowerment turns into delegation, and then people start delegating responsibility. And anytime you do that, you really have to have a high confidence level in those people that you are empowering. Yeah, some of the same thing there. So that's all I got. Didn't want to spend a whole lot of time. I did have some thoughts on power. Wanted to share those with you. Hopefully this little quick video was beneficial to you, and appreciate all that you all are doing. It's my first time teaching online, and I'm certainly enjoying it and enjoying watching you teach each other and certainly share your experiences. One other point is, or one final point, is that there is an article that I posted in the module, and this week's discussion question is going to be related to that article. So you'll see it in the discussion board, and you'll see the article in the module. So hope everyone had a great week last week and looking forward to another great week with you this week. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon.